everybody. So I'm Gerard Boss. I'm the director of the Business and Biodiversity program at IUCN, but very pleased to welcome you on behalf of the whole We Value Nature team. So this is part of the 10-day challenge. Some of you have already participated, and we're very grateful for that. We are on day 7 or 8, and I lost count now. And this particular session is focusing on sustaining momentum, because we don't want all these great sessions just to inspire us only at the moment that we're listening to them, but we want to make sure that we are sustaining the momentum after that. And actually, the daily challenge that we have got for today, which if you have registered to the 10-day challenge, you're receiving that every morning, is actually focused on getting inspired. So if you have great videos, blogs, or other suggestions where you can inspire us on how to value nature and integrate that in business strategies, then please send that along. That would be great. So with no further ado, I'm going to pass over the mic to Nadine, who's going to facilitate us through the whole session, and she'll be doing that also together with John Hanneman, but I'll let Nadine introduce the rest of the session. Welcome again, and have a great session. I'll be with you also throughout.
Super. Thank you, Gerard. No, it's really great to be here. Firstly, let me introduce myself. My name is Nadine McCormick. I'm with now the World of Business Council for Sustainable Development, where I'm manager of the Nature Action Project. So the World Business Council is one of the partner organizations in the We Value Nature campaign, but this is the 4th week that I've been at WBCC, and before that, some of you may have known me from my IUCN days, where I was also very actively involved in the We Value Nature campaign through the Business and Biodiversity program. So I have to say I'm also being very ably assisted by some ex-colleagues as well. So Leanne and Ella from the Business Biodiversity program are supporting in the background as well. So yeah, I'm very personally interested in this topic. As a change agent ourselves, I think all of us on the call here today and looking through some of the names here, we are all trying to create change, whether it's in our own organizations or we're supporting especially companies to try to take action. And I think one of the big, what we see is there's a big focus always on the technical side, but I think it's the people side, it's the organizational change side, which is often forgotten. And so here the intent with this session is to help us identify issues that can affect this momentum, keeping the energy going. So it's like, oh, you know, I tried something, but it took so much energy, then we kind of ran out of steam and then it didn't go any further. Or, you know, I'm just so busy right now and I'm kind of on my own, I can't make the time for it, even though I know it's really important. And so it's these type of issues that show up, whether we're talking about natural capital or some other change that we want business to put in place, or even, you know, thinking about our own family. So really today, what we're going to help you do is actually diagnose and identify what some of those typical blocking issues are at an individual level and an organizational level, but then importantly, then identify strategies for navigating around those issues and even maybe in avoiding them. And so there'll be a theoretical framework that John Hanneman will share with us, but also applying real life insights throughout. So you realize this is not just theory, but actually this is something that's very practical and actually can help us, changing business, changing our communities and our own families or even ourselves. So the agenda looks a little bit like those objectives. So we'll start now with just some quick context setting. And then John will give an introduction to social entrepreneurship as a way of learning lessons on, you know, overcoming institutional inertia. But then we also want to make this very active learning from yourselves as well. So then we're going to offer an opportunity for some individual reflection and then a poll to kind of see where you are in the typical individual and organizational barriers that come up. Then we'll look into identifying those challenges more, again, offering a poll and reflection period. And then a final kind of part of the presentation around navigations of how we navigate around the different institutional inertia issues and how therefore we can sustain momentum. At that stage, we're going to take a very short coffee break, but you know, it's a 2-hour session. It's important that we do have a chance to stand up, refill our water bottles, pop to the loo and all of that. And then after the break, we'll come back for some small group discussions. And again, a topic like this, It's so important to get down to the individual level. You can hear it and think how it applies to others, but part of this is recognizing how it applies to you. So we're offering that space, a facilitated, a guided discussion with a Google Doc already prepared for some small 3 or 4 people breakout discussions for you, so you can take what you've heard today and apply it in your context and come up with some useful way forward. And then we'll finish there with sharing of real application of how we've seen this in natural capital journeys in contexts that you're aware of, whether personally or other colleagues as well. And then wrap up and last words, and really again a call to action. So this, I invite you to be very active in your listening. You will get more out of it the more that you put in. We'll give plenty of time for, say, that reflection and application in your own journey. So yeah, in the meantime, so you've heard from Gerard already. Myself, I'm Nadine McCormick with WBCC, as I said, and then shortly we'll have John Herniman, who's working with Cranfield University, but coming out of Lausanne in Switzerland down the lake here as a researcher. And I just want to say that actually John and I were reflecting, we actually met about a year ago exactly, just as the lockdown started hitting in Switzerland, and an Impact Hub event in Geneva, talking around how this could be an opportunity for change and positive change, and when the lockdown was all really cool and exciting. So yeah, we have our 1-year anniversary, so I'm really happy that John was able to join us here today as well and bring his amazing PhD work into a way that we can all benefit from. So as you know, typically the simple rules, you're all on mute, which is great. When we invite for reflections, we do invite you to open your camera. It's really nice to see you as well, but of course no obligation to do so. But do be interactive, do share as much as possible. We're going to learn from each other. And of course, there'll be polling throughout in the Zooms. You don't need your Mentimeter phones. There'll be Zoom polling, and then we'll have a live Google Doc as well. And maybe just a final plea as well to rename yourselves in the participants list. And so to do that, if you click on the participants list, hover over your name, click on more, and then please select rename, because it'd be really good to see what organizations you are with. So I can see Christina from Lund University, for example, has done that really well. Thank you. Yes, and then without, let's see, and then next. So yeah, that's just a description of how you can change your name. So please do that. And then actually it's a chance to kind of just hear who you are as well. So the first part is just labeling who you're with, which organization you're with. And then let's use the chat box now. So please, can you just in the chat box, just type in the chat box, where are you sitting right now? So I'm not going to do it, but if I was going to do it now, I would say, I'm sitting in our spare bedroom in a village just above Lake Geneva in Switzerland. What am I expecting today? What am I keen to learn about? In this case, I'm actually really learned to hear about your practical examples of where you're getting stuck individually at an organization level, so we can really refine the framework that's going to be presented today. So that's what I'm excited to hear about. So please, take a couple of minutes and in the chat box, share with us, where are you sitting right now? And what are you expecting from today? What are you hoping to most get out of this today? So somebody's got to go first already. So where are you sitting? I'm assuming Elizabeth Tamayo is in Germany, if you're with Frankfurt University. Or guessing Christina with Lund University, you're in Sweden. So where are you sitting right now in the chat box? And just what are you expecting for today? What would you love to get out of today? There's an acronym I'm not so familiar with, DBDG, Sophie, that's doing business, doing good, really great to have you here as well. So thank you, Gerard. So yeah, Annecy in France on the other side of the lake. We're here. Yeah, IUCN is very keen to learn about how we can help you unlock the natural capital journey in your organizations or the ones that you're supporting. So let's just hear some other responses, please. Marge near Lausanne, thank you. Team IUCN, great on the ball, thank you. So where are others? Thank you, Christina. I guess you're in Sweden. Yeah, oh, but you're sitting in Holland, you see? That's important information. Yes, and you are also working with business and helping them on their journey to value nature, exactly. So yeah, this is the complementary side to the technical side. Let's hear for some others. So Laura, you're sitting in Flensburg in Germany. working with IMS Luxembourg. You want to know how to motivate organizations to get involved in the biodiversity conversation. Great, we're definitely going to have stuff for you here. Let's hear a couple more. And in the meantime, if you've finished, please do update your participant name as well so we can see your organization. Let's hear a couple more. PJ, you're near Lake Geneva as well. You're looking about bringing change in companies as well. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and you've had some experience trying to get companies to uptake on biodiversity performance measurement processes as well. So I'll be interested to hear what you learned today and how that reflects your experience over the last couple of years with us. Hi, Andreas, good time. Really great to see you. So you need to update your name, Andreas, so we all know that you're from GIZ. So you're sitting in Bonn, and you're happy to exchange about these concrete applications. So again, GIZ is doing some amazing work in India and Brazil and other parts with SMEs in particular about how do we get them on this journey as well. So how does this apply? So David, you're in the UK. Okay, gathering biodiversity data. I'm not sure this is the event for you, but there's been plenty of events, including last Monday. You can look at the IUCN event on biodiversity performance guidelines, but let's see what they do with the data. And Sophie, sitting in the south of Germany, you're also working and guiding companies and getting them towards regeneration. And Elisa in Amstelveen, in Amsterdam, and Martine from the Capitals Coalition, great to have you here in Haarlem. Yeah, I love this word nudge. You want to nudge people in the right direction. How do we do that? And Natalia, yeah, student at UNIGE, the University in Geneva, and you're also looking at strategies for getting companies to think about circular economy. Great. Okay, so you're all here now. So think about this particular context that you're in and how does this relate to what you're doing. So I just want to give some very brief context to where this fits into the whole We Value Nature campaign. I must say that I gave most of this presentation on Wednesday morning last week. So my idea is actually to not go through all this in detail, but I want to say that it's a key part of the We Value Nature campaign to be clear on our theory of change. And so we talk about change at different levels, which is why we specified individuals and organizational level. This is where the institution inertia piece fits in. On a project level, where people get stuck around data, scoping out the right question, etc. Like there have been many events looking at that, but we're really looking at how we get change at that individual level and the organizational level, guided by my favorite acronym, which is ADCAR. At the top, again, you have a full description of this at the event last Wednesday, the plenary on insights. But, you know, being aware, having the willingness and the readiness to actually take action on nature, which is reflected in the theory of change for the whole campaign. So really, this where the We Value Nature campaigns is to accelerate where we get stuck at the individual level, which shows up as words of like being aware and knowing the benefits to do something. Then you see change at the project level. So how you do one first natural capital assessment, then what? How do you make sure that you keep the momentum going so that you get then change at a company level and then ultimately getting aligned values and more regenerative, etc. I just want to show you where institutional shows up. I mean, we haven't made up this term. Actually, the Capitals Coalition, or formerly the Natural Capital Coalition, came up with this term. We'd like to change it because I think it's actually misunderstood. It's not very inspiring either, but this inertia, getting stuck, shows up in 2016 to 2018 as a third level. 2020, it was actually a bit further down, so around equal fifth in a survey that we did at the end of last year. And then going forwards, it's actually dropped down a bit. So it's interesting to reflect on as well, like, so why is that? Perhaps, yeah, people, you know, we've got greater momentum going now, actually. And I think it's easier to keep momentum going because more and more people are talking about the importance of nature. But still, it's this hidden area. The Harvard Business Review has some interesting cases. If you don't pay attention to this people side, that you can push on the technical side as much as you like, but you won't get as far. So we still feel that it's important. But yeah, so this was a rapid lightning tour into, like, you know, where this fits into the We Value Nature campaign and why we're doing this. But without further ado, I'd love to hand over to John Honeyman now for the first piece of the presentation puzzle on how to, the framing of social entrepreneurship as a way to overcome inertia. So with that, John, I'd love to hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Nadine. I really appreciate it. And thank you, Gerard, for your earlier introduction as well. Very excited to be here today. Looking forward to the challenge of taking a huge topic and trying to compress it into a 2-hour or less session. So view this as somewhat more informational than transformational as a session. But if you engage in some of the exercises, I think you'll get an idea of the concept of the mapping of the social entrepreneur journey from a personal perspective and how that might apply to some of the challenges you face along the way. And now our first challenge is, can I move the slides? Let's see. And I can. So I've overcome the first challenge of this session. The real challenge with social innovation are the two words it's made up of. One is innovation. In any organization or business, especially large organizations and businesses, innovation actually presents a challenge to everyone in the business because it's something different. It's breaking the norms that people have in the business, and it's doing something different. This is actually doubled as a challenge when that innovation is social. And especially in my studies, I've looked at for-profit organizations. So often the social aspect of the business is contrary to the traditional agency theory approaches that businesses are designed around maximizing profit for the shareholders of the business. So social innovation in itself is counter to norms, and it's also working on a metric which isn't the core metric of the business. So for any social innovation, so it's definitely challenging. It's also risky for some of the people who take part in the social innovation. And any of you in the audience who are social entrepreneurs, I'm sure you'll agree it's a very tiring process. The research we're going to talk about today takes a slightly alternative perspective to most approaches to social innovation and social entrepreneurs. What we're going to do is we're actually going to look at the social entrepreneur journey from the perspective of the social entrepreneur and not the perspective of the organization, their context, the projects or the project outcomes they have, and also not considering them as heroes. Typically, literature and practitioner literature will often talk about social entrepreneurs as heroes. What I wanted to do in my research is look more at the people and individual challenges that social entrepreneurs faced from their perspective in for-profit organizations and how they overcome these barriers and challenges. This might be personal inertia with themselves or with other individuals. It may be challenges with the organization itself, or it may be challenges within the institutions they inhabit. And as part of this journey, we're going to look at some examples of this. Now, on the left-hand side, you'll see me use an analogy of a journey throughout what we're going to talk about. I'm viewing what we're talking about today as almost an awareness thing. It's looking at the challenges on the journey, the valleys and the hills and the oases that you come across on the journey, to somewhat make people aware and pre-informed about what might be on that journey, like opening a map and predicting what might be ahead. I was thinking of a present day analogy to this, and it's getting a COVID vaccine. If you know that there might be side effects, you know that these side effects are common, and you know some simple mitigation strategies, the challenge and the dauntingness about going to get a vaccine is less so. It's a map. It's not the answers, but it's a map of where you might go. So let's start our discussion of the journey. So social entrepreneurs. For the purpose of what we're going to talk about today, I studied social entrepreneurs focused on them being individuals inside big or small organizations, for-profit or non-profit. In my particular case, it was large organizations which were for-profit, but predominantly inside an organization, making innovative change inside an existing organization. The second aspect which distinguishes social entrepreneurs is they're working on social innovation and not traditional innovation. They're actually creating some sort of social change. And by social, I mean environmental, sustainability, social conditions for workers, a very broad approach to social change. And then lastly, and very importantly, we're talking about people who are doing innovation. It's not business as usual. It's not the people who are employed solely to do that change. It's people who are innovating beyond their normal job description. Now, this seems like a really crisp and nice definition, and sort of Elkington on the right-hand side in his Skoll report summarized what a social intrapreneur is really nicely. Someone who works inside major corporations to promote practical solutions to social or environmental challenges. I think that's a nice wrapper around this. What it doesn't reveal, though, is the complexity behind who are social intrapreneurs. They may be CSR professionals who want to innovate beyond their CSR remit. They may be innovators in an organization and an R&D department who want to actually make social change as well as technical innovations. They may be activists, radicals, or social entrepreneurs who want to actually join a larger organization to get more leverage. So it actually becomes, when looking at who the social intrapreneurs are and how they operate, it becomes a very rich topic for research, which is how I came to this picture. So quick bit about my background and some of the research findings you're going to see. I started my career in technical innovation, running technical innovation groups in large corporations. I became increasingly aware of social impacts of large companies and how those might be woven into how the companies do business and how much leverage those large companies have on creating social change. When I became aware of this, I started some internal programs such as solar programs, environmental cleanup programs, worker health programs, and worker condition programs, and was surprised about the variability on how easy or hard it was. Each program had completely different challenges. That spurred me to do some doctoral research, and I'm just hopefully finishing up my PhD at the moment, on the challenges and navigations that social intrapreneurs take in large corporations. And it was a quantitative analysis looking through interviews with a lot of social intrapreneurs. I did 78 interviews, which were included in the research, across 19 large multinationals, across multiple industries, looking at what tensions these intrapreneurs faced, what navigations they used to get past these tensions. And then at the latter stage of the research, looking at, are there any differences based on the type of social intrapreneur they are in an organization, in how they navigate their social intrapreneur journey. Now, I should point out there's one challenge in all this, is the social intrapreneurial journey for every social intrapreneur is unique. It's a combination of the organization they're in, their personal purpose, how they want to move through that situation. And what I looked for here is integrating common findings across a large pool of these intrapreneurs, and that's what we're going to talk about as we move forward. But first, I think we're going to go across to a poll.
We do, yes, Alice, if you can help us launch the first polling question. So actually, John, I'm just wondering if you could reframe this question for people who are supporting companies as well. So either if you're in a company, think about what support does your organization give to natural capital initiatives in general, and then what support does your organization give to your natural capital initiatives? So it's not just in general natural capital, but then we're going to differentiate with yours. So then if it's somebody who's working with companies, how would you frame these questions?
That's actually a good question. I think actually it can be focused on the host company that you're working with. Like, is that host company supportive of natural capital initiatives? And is that host company that you're working with particularly supportive of the natural capital initiative that you're working on?
Yeah. So Martine, for example, and the Capitals Coalition, I mean, in general, they give like loads of support to natural capital initiatives, but then being cheeky, and this is very anonymous, we won't know, when it comes to your initiatives and the Capitals Coalition, Martine, how much support do you have for what you're putting forward? And I think that's the important distinction here. So it's in general, how supportive they are on natural capital. And when you're bringing something forward, how supportive, and then we can actually see and then already start to see where some of the barriers are, if they're more at an individual level or the organizational level. So I see just about half have voted. Let's wait for a couple more votes, please. Yeah, so we're actually, there's quite clear results already. So Ella, actually, I think you can end that poll and then show the results, please. And then John, if you just want to talk us through what you're seeing.
Whoa, okay. This is good, actually. I like the red bars there, like the direct support, people having direct support. You're very lucky. And I'm very impressed with that. But I'm also not surprised that there's probably 33%, I guess it is, of people who are experiencing either passive support or no support. And that's very typical. In fact, with my somewhat random sample of social intrapreneurs for my research, it was almost a 50-50 split and so not too dissimilar from what I'm seeing here. But you'll see as we get later on in the presentation, the level of direct support, passive support, or no support that intrapreneurs have often affects the journey that they take, the choices they make on how they navigate certain barriers, and what barriers they see along the way. I should actually highlight, it doesn't make the journey any easier for either type. The types of barriers which come up are just different barriers along the way, and also result in different ways of moving the initiative forward.
Okay. Do you think there's anything, I mean, I'm looking at these results and they look the same, whether it's the general organization support and then for the individual and their initiative. So is that a message in itself that it's actually quite aligned, right? Like
quite a lot, yeah. And actually that's unusual. So I was expecting there to be a slight difference. We'll see when we look at some of the barriers, especially around values, that often organizations and individuals can share high-level values, macro-level values, but their micro-level values are somewhat in conflict. So they may be supportive of natural capital activity, but not your particular natural capital activity. So it doesn't look like that's the case with this audience. So, so that's actually maybe a positive thing. It always comes as a shock to me when there is that misalignment.
Super, great. Okay, so actually, Ella, we can stop sharing those results now. That's brilliant. And if you've actually already got any comments or reflections, you can throw them in the chat box as well. We'll keep going. But if you have any like, oh, actually, this is what I think, then feel free to put them in the chat box. So John, let's move on to then the challenges then.
Yeah, we will indeed. Okay. So we're going to talk through the challenges which were revealed from the research. And these are, sort of the process used was to take all the interviews, break them down in individual phrases and textually analyze them and group them together to look for patterns that emerged in the challenges that these individuals trying to bring about social change in organizations experienced. And so we're going to go through three main levels. One is at an individual level. So these are challenges of the social intrapreneur with either themselves or other individuals. We're then also going to talk about organizational challenges. They're challenges of the individual social intrapreneur with the organization. And then some challenges which exist beyond the boundaries of the organization. So the first level that we're going to look at here is people's selves, the challenge they experience with themselves. And we'll go on to a slightly different view of the world here. Perfect. And you'll see this social intrapreneur journey reoccur a bit later. But one of the starting challenges that individual social intrapreneurs often have with themselves is, first of all, coming up with the idea. Many people can come up with lots of great social intrapreneurial activities they can do in their organization. But the bigger challenge appears to be choosing that idea, going through the ideas which are possibles that you can see yourself doing and saying, this is the one I'm going to commit to. This is the one I'm going to fight as a battle moving through through the organization. One, in my research, there was some interesting concepts which came up where there were many cases where people were describing others usually who'd come up with great ideas which were going to change the world, that it was perfect for their organization, but their manager or their manager's manager had said no. And at that stage, they said, okay, I'm done, I'm stopping. They've said no. Someone gave a great title to these people called winovators, as in whining and innovators. There were people who said, you're sort of like, I had a great idea, but you said no, so we're just not going to do it. Now, if anyone's feeling a little uncomfortable at this stage, I always feel uncomfortable talking about this because everyone has a little bit of a winovator in them. But the differentiators of successful social entrepreneurs are the ones who get past that on one idea, where they say, it's a great idea. Even if someone says no initially, I'm going to come back and I'm going to try it differently, approach it differently, and try to move forward. The second thing from an individual challenge point of view, and this is individuals with themselves, are the challenge of bandwidth, fear of failure, and also fear of being marginalized in an organization. And this is something which comes up frequently, the bandwidth and burnout aspects. Often, and this goes back to the earlier bit about whether you have formal support for your organization. Often, if you don't have formal support from your organization, you're trying to do your day job, your family life, and on top of that, you have your social innovation you're trying to do. So it's like a third extra activity in your life. Even those people who have formal support from their organizations also experience some level of fatigue and bandwidth challenges because the expectations are really high. And in the research, I often found that social initiatives were often held to a higher standard than other business initiatives. They were more critiqued, and we'll see that a little later. There were questions about them. And so the challenge for the social innovator was this level of running faster than everyone else. The second stage of this, though, is not only do individuals have challenges with themselves, they have challenges with those around them. Sometimes your peers, and I had a few really exceptional examples of people's peers who wanted them to fail in their social innovation, because of organizational competition. Also, there's cases of managers who struggle to actually see the benefit to themselves as managers with the social innovation. This may be the incentive plan of the organization or how the manager perceives themselves, but they may present barriers to the employee who's trying to actually carry out a social innovation because it doesn't further the manager's role in the organization. And the last individual level of challenge is with values. And this goes back to our earlier conversation about alignment. Organizations and individuals all have values. Social entrepreneurs have values. Social entrepreneurs may have value sets which differ from their managers. Their managers may be focused on maximizing the profit for their particular group or always hitting their milestones. And the social entrepreneur's value set may be orientated around helping as many people as possible. The organizations also have this same value difference with individual social entrepreneurs. Some organizations can be non-social, not focused on social missions. And a social entrepreneur is constantly fighting the organization and the organization's focus on non-social missions. More interestingly to me is when the organization's pro-social, the social entrepreneur's pro-social, but they don't align. I was trying to think of a natural capital example here, so I may get this wrong, but it might be like the social entrepreneur is really interested in wetland recovery, whereas the organization only cares about forest initiatives. And so even though on the surface of things, they should be working together, there can be huge barriers presented in the organization from these two very similar missions. that organizations and individuals have. Try it. Next slide now. Okay.
Yeah, I should say that shows up a lot in one of the other surveys we've done. It's a focus on single issues. So a company will like, we're doing loads on climate, or we're doing loads on plastic, but getting it to translate through to more broadly getting nature into all decision making. So yeah, we've seen that show up as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and actually in my examples, I often saw organizations who'd focus on sustainability, but not help workers' rights, or the other way around. They'd be heavily focused on workers' rights in their factories, but they'd be doing a terrible job for the local community and the local environment by pushing waste out into the local community. And it's those conflicts which are kind of interesting if you join an organization and you think they're going to be supportive, but really they're supportive of something which isn't quite what you want to do.
Yeah. And maybe there's just one reflection, maybe you can, as you're speaking again now, so from Christina in London University, she was saying she's struggling to think about organizational level because the university is so large and compartmentalized. So yeah, thinking from a faculty level, then more broadly at university level. So about organizations, like how do we break down which level of the organization?
Perfect question. I really like that question. Actually, it leads into the next part of the presentation. Perfect. If we focus on the bottom left, so bottom right circle here. Whoops, we went forward one extra slide there. Let's see if I can. Are you able to take us back a slide, Nadine?
Sorry, I just tried to go mute and I moved it. Sorry.
Can we go back to the circles? Perfect. That one's fine. So when we look at the challenges presented to the individual social entrepreneur by organizations, this goes into a much more traditional space that we see, and I'm sure there's been lots of activity in the 10-day challenge around this, around organizational structures and organizational processes driving barriers for social entrepreneurial activity. Structures such as compartmentalization of different functions in an organization. It may be silos between those organizations, but it may also be, even to a different extreme, physical separation. I talked to one organization who talked about how great it was that their sustainability group had been given a special building all on their own in a forest environment, and it had, sort of eco-friendly, sort of rooms. Everything was perfect, except for many of the sustainability people in the organization complained they could never get hold of anyone because they were on a completely different campus. That in itself is creating a barrier to, sort of sustainability. So structures can actually be very much like the question at an individual department level, or it can be groups of departments, or it can be the whole organization putting in places barriers which need to be overcome to actually move things forward. A very subtle difference is processes. So organizations build processes such around incentives, rewards for people, IT processes and legal processes. And most of those are designed around delivering the primary mission of the organization. And in most cases, the primary mission of the organization is for-profit goals in the studies I did. And those become difficult when you're trying to include beneficiaries rather than other companies in legal agreements. Those actually prevent barriers along the way. So there's a whole raft of organizational structures and processes and difficulties. One last example that I'll give is when people do quarterly business reviews, does the sustainability initiative come in the first slides? Or is it the last slide that they never get to because the meeting always overruns? That's a big distinction of a barrier on how people get things done in organizations. If it was the first slide, the discussion would center around it and there'd be importance around it. If it's the last slide, it rarely gets touched upon, or it's rushed through as we'll get back to it next quarter. So there's structural and processual barriers created. Beyond that, though, beyond the bounds of the organization, often there's institutional and cultural barriers which are presented to the individual social intrapreneur. Now, these institutional and cultural are very vague terms and can mean a lot of different things to different people. But at the beyond the organization, I'm thinking about barriers which are related to regulations, for example, that, you know, sort of maybe in healthcare industry is a good example of there can be innovations in patient diagnostics, but privacy structures in the institution of healthcare actually prevent information being shared to actually uncover new diagnostic techniques in many cases. Also, the institution of, you know, sort of capitalistic structures around businesses present an underlying direction in businesses to actually make profits and make short-term profits for shareholders rather than work on longer-term social and sustainability initiatives. So there's multiple levels of these challenges which exist. And I think the next slide is the one I want to go to. Let's check. Yep. So these are actually expanded a little more, and we're going to use these for the next poll, I believe.
Yeah, we're going to do some personal reflection first though, right?
We are, yes. Actually, do you want to introduce the personal reflection, Nadine?
Yeah, so I guess here we've got a slide, you're summarizing the main challenges here based on, you know, that individual, the organizational or outside the organizational structure. And so what we're going to invite you to do now is actually, you know, open up a Word doc or grab an old-fashioned, you know, pen and piece of paper and do think about a particular context. So I would encourage you rather than think like in general, but, you know, if you're working with a particular company now and you're a bit stuck, or, you know, just wondering, or even in your own organization for about an internal change initiative you're trying to get through. So think about a very concrete situation rather than generally. Think about what are the main challenges that you're currently up against. So we've got the list of them here now, and it's more about thinking, you know, is it really around, you know, is it the personal level, is it about the manager level, is it about not being able to break through particular processes in the organization? So we are actually going to take a couple of minutes here now to have a pause, and then after that we are going to open up a poll for you then to highlight which of were your top challenges, and then we'll see what that looks like across the group. But you do need to do that reflection first now, just for a couple of minutes before we open. Actually, Ella, you can already open up the poll now, actually, so then people can start filling it in when they've completed it. But I do encourage you to actually just think now for yourselves about a particular context, rather than generally, specifically, and which are the particular barriers that you have. Yeah, I think the thing that struck the first time I heard John speaking when he talked about this Winovator approach, it was really tough because somebody who has lots of ideas, I'm like, oh no, actually I got stuck because I just didn't commit to an idea. That was a really great idea, but I just let it go because somebody said no. So I just think of all these other ideas I've missed out on now. So brilliant, the results are starting to come in now. So have a think, yeah, really specifically in your context, in your situation. If you're honest about it, and you can be anonymous here, if you're honest about it, where are you getting stuck? So about a quarter of you voted there. Now I'm going to leave it open for a couple of more minutes, and then Ella, I'll get you to share. Gerard, I see you brought your video back. Do you want to share some thoughts while the last points come in?
Yeah, perhaps two instances, and that was when I was with the corporate world. One instance which was quite interesting is that I had the privilege to work with WBCSD on the Vision 2050 exercise. And when I presented back the Vision 2050 outcome, which was 20% of my time, to the company, they said, oh no, we know all this. Yeah, we know exactly where this vision is going, and we're already implementing it all. And I said, I missed something in my communication. I either did not communicate it well, because for me it was groundbreaking and it was really new. And actually I'm doing a plug for WBCSD because on the 25th of March, the end of the week, they're going to refresh and they're going to relaunch the Vision 2050. And the reaction then from my supervisor, or the person I was working with, which worked very closely with the CEO, really struck me, and I was really disappointed. And so I went away, went back into my office, and actually wondering, what did I do wrong? And suddenly I realized that I showed all the activities that a company was already working on and how great it was that our activities were aligned with where the Vision 2050 was taking us. What I should have done is the opposite, was actually showing all the activities that we didn't consider at all, which were on that Vision 2050 roadmap, and where the company I was working for actually hadn't addressed and was not, let's say, permeable to. And when I actually showed that to the strategy department, suddenly I got a whole cohort of analysts and financial support and HR support to actually look at these specific areas which hadn't been tackled by the company. So sometimes you have to look at, the half glass empty rather than glass half full. We always try to look at the glass half full, but sometimes looking at the glass half empty is quite interesting as well. So I just wanted to share that experience, and I'll have others I can share later.
Yeah, brilliant, Gerard. Thank you.
Yeah.
So yeah, we
can I jump in here? Yeah, Gerard, that's a perfect example, and we should have. This could have been us aligning around the next section around how you create legitimacy for the sort of the initiative. That's a good example of focusing on the gaps rather than focusing on the non-gaps. Yeah, I really like that example.
So we're showing the results there now, John. So again, are they what you're expecting? What do you normally see here?
Well, the good news on this is they're all over the place, which is what I like to see, because it somewhat revalidates my research, where so all the examples I gave earlier of these challenges exist across the board generally. So I'd be really worried if we had an audience who didn't have half these challenges. It would concern me about the validity of my research. So what I like to see here is, there's challenges which are occurring in various different parts of this framework of challenges. And it points out to what I said earlier, and what I'll reiterate at the end of this talk, is that every social initiative is somewhat of a unique journey. Sort of people have personal purposes which are focusing on something that they need to do. The organization has a unique context that it wants things done in, and wider culture and the environment has a different influence on that. So actually creating a unique journey, and that's what these challenges identify to me as. People are facing different challenges in different contexts, which they have to go and address. I am surprised that cultural norms sort of comes up as such a high value there at the bottom. And maybe in the discussion section towards the end of this, we can come back to that to talk about why cultural norms are playing such a large role there.
Yeah, right. Okay, so let's move to the last part of your presentation, and now it's about how we navigate around these challenges and sustain momentum. Then we'll take a short coffee break before the breakout rooms.
Perfect. Okay, let me get to the slides, and I'm looking forward to coffee, so I'm going to move fast here. So we've talked about challenges that individuals face in trying to work through a social initiative in a large organization. The other part of that is, what do these individuals do? Whether these are actual mitigations and make things better, or they perceive that they make things better, is not clearly. I'm not going to clearly distinguish, but there's a whole series of navigations or mitigations people take along the way, and I always think of it in that map analogy of, are they going around a barrier? Are they going over a barrier? Are they going under a barrier? Are they going through a barrier? And the example for through a barrier might be confrontation, that you go straight up to it and you just start hitting the barrier until you get through it. And we'll talk about that briefly in a minute. So there's a huge amount of navigations. And so we're going to focus down on just a few for this talk. One of the first findings, though, was just the diversity of navigations that social intrapreneurs use in real life. It's not just, I went out there and I got support for my initiative and everything was wonderful. There's a whole different diverse portfolio or typology of navigations people use to drive their initiative forward. And it's often contradictory. This diagram set up this way very deliberately. For example, confrontation and acceptance and compromise are actually somewhat contradictory as navigations, but in certain circumstances, they're the right navigation. In some circumstances, confrontation is right, of someone going in and demanding that their initiative move to this next stage. Sometimes that situation works, surprisingly. Other times, either accepting what the organization is telling you, that's dangerously close to the why innovators, or compromising is the path forward, where you have an initiative, you have to compromise to do 50% of the benefit rather than 100% of the benefit. And the quote, "the perfect is the enemy of the good," often comes up when talking about this, that it's better to sort of reduce carbon in the atmosphere by 10% rather than go for the 20% that you wanted, but know you're going to fail because there's no way you can actually get to that with your particular project. Also, the other thing which came out at a very macro level when looking at navigations were patterns form around how navigations interlink with each other. And we'll talk about this right at the end before coffee break, but sometimes certain positions in an organization lead to certain navigations, and certain navigations lead to other navigations. So a complex web along the journey of how these navigations evolve. But what I'm going to focus on for the next 5-10 minutes is the horizontal bar, avoidance and legitimacy. Again, two things which are somewhat contrary to each other: hiding something or making it visible and legitimate in an organization. As we saw at the beginning with the first poll, sort of people have somewhat of formal legitimacy here. 67% of people felt that they were being formally supported by their organization. So that plays a lot into the distribution of legitimacy as an important aspect in how you move forward on a social initiative. But there's multiple ways that were revealed of how people generate legitimacy in organization. There's the formal part where someone's expecting you to do the social initiative in the organization. You already have some legitimacy, a champion, you're part of an innovation initiative in the organization, there's support or there's sponsors in the organization. This in itself doesn't make the initiative hugely easy. You still have to pitch the initiative to the organization, and very much as Gerard was saying, you sort of build support in the organization that is something important to do. So some of the mitigation paths that people were using, even if they were formally supported by the organization, is the importance of framing the initiative. And by framing, I mean frame it in terms that are relevant to the organization, either in terms which are relevant to the individual manager you're working with, that they can actually see how this is actually a benefit in their real world, and how this might actually benefit them and their initiatives and their purpose. Also framing in a way of aligning with the organizational purpose or goals. An example, not natural capital example, but a financial example is if you're a financial organization and you want to do a social innovation initiative, often the ones which get accepted most are the ones where you're creating maybe financial instruments for marginalized youth who can't use credit cards or banking, or impoverished communities which need financial instruments. So linking it to the goals of the organization and not making it too extremely different from the goals of the organization, so it fits in a strategic discussion of the organization. The next stage, though, moving on from framing, is creating shared value around the initiative, of designing the initiative around not only being good for beneficiaries, but putting it in terms of being good for the organization as well. So the organization gains something out of this initiative. I'm going to give a very simple example from my past, which was I was working in an organization trying to reduce the carbon footprint impact of, in this case, executives flying all over the world for 1-hour meetings on multiple business trips. I was kind of extremely uncomfortable about the amount of air travel we did for typically less than a 1-day meeting. But the way I actually framed that in a shared value context was the amount of money, if these executives have done video conferencing for many of the meetings, the amount of money that the organization would save in air travel and business travel. On top of that, the executives were very stressed and overworked, so they also benefited from being away from home for less time. And also by avoiding the air travel, we reduced sort of the carbon footprint of the company. That was the way that initiative actually got considered on the strategic plan in terms of its dollar impact to the company rather than its environmental impact. For me, it was a win because the company actually did the initiative. For the CFO thought it was a win because we were saving lots of money as the organization. Now, this can backfire. In my research, I found some organizations where people could get lots of support through their shared value discussion, only to find as the initiative continued, the support was really for their prototype solution and not their scaled solution. A couple of organizations talked about supporting the social, or a couple of social entrepreneurs talked about being very well supported by their organization. But as soon as they produced a prototype and the organization could use it for marketing purposes of we're focused on the environment, they weren't allowed to scale any of their innovations past that point. So that's one challenge to look out for along the legitimacy route. The other thing which is often overlooked, and this goes to the real title of this presentation, is maintaining momentum or sustaining momentum, is just because you've gained legitimacy through one set of framing or social value discussion doesn't mean that that legitimacy stays. And through my research, I actually found this was one of the biggest surprises to me, is the dynamic nature. You can have an initiative that's actually supported and people go out to support it, but the manager will change that you justified it to, the organizational goals will change, or the marketplace or external politics will change. Many social initiatives have changed because of the falling price of oil or political nature in the world. And that means that something you had legitimacy for and you could move forward with now has a pile of barriers that you need to overcome. The last bit about legitimacy as well, which is important, is often once you've justified a project, it really is only for the prototype stage or the pilot stage. At each stage, a social entrepreneur should be ready to re-justify the project time and time again, because at each stage, different investment, different partners become involved in the product. And often social entrepreneurs would complain about the fact that they had to re-justify often, but it's almost a predictable part of any successful project moving forward. I'm going to briefly touch on informal and social capital now. So informal legitimacy generation, if someone doesn't have direct legitimacy in an organization to do a social initiative, one of the paths that I saw frequently followed was the use of external competitions or coalitions or movements, where by aligning an idea, which was in the early stages, or taking it to an external competition and winning the competition, gave some level of legitimacy when you took it back to your organization to say, people care about this, it's important, let's have a dialogue about whether we move forward with this initiative. And there were multiple, surprisingly, about a third of the population that I studied used informal approaches to gain the first level of legitimacy and to start off their journey. And the last element, social capital, not to be confused with natural capital. Social capital, many people gained legitimacy for their projects through a combination of somewhat formal or informal legitimacy, but also their previous performance. People trusted them because they'd done good things for the company in the past. So this shouldn't be underlooked as a way of overcoming navigations. The trust element that people generate from someone saying, well, this seems a radical idea, but in the past, your ideas have all borne out, you followed through with them, they've been successful. This is actually a navigation process that people often use in organizations. And in the interest of time, I'm going to hop on to avoidance. So legitimacy is letting the whole world know about your project, having the organizational immune system come and attack you. The opposite side of this is people actually running projects in avoidance mode, mainly conceal, which I call hide and shrink, either hiding the project, bootlegging it, doing it out of hours, doing it in secret in your office, doing it at home over the weekend, or the shrinking process of making the project as small as possible so it doesn't trigger the organizational immune system. So you actually get to build something and try something out before you make it visible to everyone else and have people asking for your justification. Those paths of avoidance and concealment were very, very often used by social intrapreneurs who didn't have any legitimacy in the organization for doing a social action. So this was their way of creating a prototype, which they could later then use to say, look, I've tried this out. This idea does work. Can I scale it larger in the organization? The last more extreme dimension of this, though, is the leaving aspect. And I'm always wary about talking to this to any audience, but a large proportion of the entrepreneurs that I talked to in my study, after about 2 years, had left that particular role, either to move to other roles in the same organization, in other organizations that they thought would be more supportive of their social initiatives, but also a third of those which left actually went on to be social entrepreneurs, to set up their own social direction. So this is a path that people really do take as a navigation when you feel like you've got the idea that you really want to pursue and it just keeps hitting walls and doesn't proceed any further. And then the last slide before the coffee break, I think this is Nadine's favorite slide, so I've included this. The social entrepreneurial journey that I've talked about, from social entrepreneurs starting, choosing an idea, then actually getting their idea off the ground. So in the research, and this is standard in social innovation, project evolution, sort of disembedding the initiative, actually creating something which is going outside of the organizational norms. And people use sort of two major paths, the concealed path to start off here, or a very active, visible legitimacy path. This path difference actually has implications. The concealed path has the benefit of being able to move fast and efficiently really early on. You just have your small group of people who align around the initiative with you and you can move quickly. The organization doesn't push back because it doesn't know what's going on. However, the real challenge here is, let's say the prototype is highly successful and you want to then scale it. You start introducing it more visibly into the organization and no one's really been on board in the organization along the way. You're actually at a late stage trying to get engagement with the organization. The second disadvantage of this technique is sometimes early on critique of an idea shapes the idea differently in how it evolves. So having more people see it is important. So there's a trade-off that social entrepreneurs need to make here. On the other hand, a very active, visible project gets the organizational immune reaction. But if it gets through each stage of successive funding and resourcing, it moves forward in a very solid way. There's less surprises along the way. And the other element here in the disembedding, people used coalitions, competitions, and also champions to actually drive use of their projects through this early stage of breaking with the norms of the organization. I'll just briefly touch on the sustaining momentum again. The role of justification of projects. It's real in traditional innovation. There's no reason it shouldn't be a real challenge in sort of social innovation and projects that, although they may be aligned with the organizational values, doesn't mean that they don't have to constantly be rejustified. And in some cases, the project may need to be reshaped either through pivoting or ending that project because it's no longer the right thing to do for the organization. It's often using the same tools that any innovator in an organization would use in designing a radical new project. The other element in that sustaining momentum is the fitting in, standing out element, which goes back to sort of using social capital. The goal is to fit in where possible and stand out just on the idea and the initiative that you really want to happen. Someone I was talking to was saying, if only like my team around me were less tree huggers and more business people, we'd often get through the meetings much easier. And it was more, they just wanted people around them to fit in with the business culture so that they could then propose relatively radical sustainability solutions. So that's one way to consider how to sustain momentum. And then the last section here is every social initiative comes to an end. And it's important to consider how the individual social intrapreneurs come to the end of the social initiative and what happens in the organization. Does the initiative become institutionalized in the organization and become part of business as usual, which is the success factor? Does it have to be spun off separate to the organization? Does the social intrapreneur need to leave with the initiative to make it really happen? And then the last comment there, the happy ever after comment, is throughout this, I've cared about individual social intrapreneurs and what they personally are doing on this journey. The important aspect is that people actually work through this journey, managing their bandwidth and their fatigue levels, so that at the end of their initiative, they're ready to do the next initiative and not it's a one only in their social initiative careers. With that stage, I think we might be at the end, Nadine.
This last presentation, exactly, yes. And we're surely going to be getting to just a short coffee break now, but I see some of the comments and questions that started coming in. I do want to give people time just to stand up, refresh, and come back. So maybe what you can do is in that little break, maybe you're not allowed to get a coffee if you just want to read through some of those questions, and then we might respond to them in a little moment. But let's if you could just move on to the next slide for us. So basically, yeah, here is a moment where we're just gonna give you a chance to stand up, refill your water glasses, and then come back in. We'll probably start in a few minutes. So literally is a few minute break, but it's still more important than not having a break at all. And then we're going to come back to some breakout room discussions because I can see the conversation is already now starting in the chat box. But let's bring those discussions into some small groups and then see how you can apply it in your own context. So with that, let's take a short break and we'll come back at 12 minutes past, please, the hour where you are at. So really short break, time to run off, and we're back at 12 minutes past, please. Thank you. And if Ella, if you want to pause the recording. Just going to move my video back here as well. Ella, we can, oh, you started the recording. Fantastic. Thank you so much. So I hope you enjoyed your discussions as well. We did. So we've got 3 groups to feedback from and 4 minutes. So that should work well. I'd love to just go around and just get a sense from what came up for you from your discussions. Do I get a volunteer first, or I just have to name people? So just unmute yourself, stick your video on as well, if you like. Who would like to go first? Otherwise, I'm just going to do group 1. It's just easier. All right, let's do that. Group 1. Who's feeding back from group one? One big highlight, one message or thread that came out from your discussion.
Christina, do you want to do this based on what we just said at the end of the discussion? It would be great. Christina?
Yes. Sorry, I'm trying to find my way to turn on the video, but for that, here it is. Okay. Yeah, we were actually saying that it was quite important. We were talking about the navigation, right, and the barriers that are there, but how to navigate those barriers. And we thought that it was very important to try to find a way to convey the message from nature and nature solutions to business in a language that business can understand. That sometimes, I mean, the language that they can understand is about losses and profits, and quite a lot about economic profits. So showing them the case, building the case in such a way that they can understand that they have lots of gains directly, economically, but also co-gains, as Gerard was mentioning, in engaging in a natural capital journey, so to say, or solutions.
Perfect. Thank you. Great. Okay, moving swiftly on, because some of those messages definitely came out in group 3, but let's go to group 2. Thanks, Christina. Group 2, who's going to present? What was the main thread that came out of the group 2 discussion?
Andreas, I think, is going
to.
Excuse me, I don't know who was group 1 or group 2. I was waiting that someone will call me. Yes, we were 3 persons, but we had a very interesting and diverse discussion on, let's say, maybe the main topic was how when processes of change are maturing, what are the challenges that come up? On the one hand, we talked about Robin from ITU told us about their work with the sustainability task force, which when it was established later on, it became more institutionalized, but it had the negative effect that people who were not directly involved in this task force later on were not motivated to make an extra movement to get into this. Only those who were institutionalized, secure, kept on moving in this reform process. And Leanne from IUCN had also very interesting examples also on, for instance, how the nature-based solution process is moving on and what pressures are existing in maturing this process later on, and also how the extra work is getting into a challenge, and how it is to reintegrate people also after a reform process into the normal work. From GIZ side, I tried to highlight also a little bit the failure culture we want to establish as a challenge, that innovation very often means also to fail, but it's very critical within an organization that you have to deliver, mostly you have to deliver success, and there's not a lot of room to fail and exchange about mistakes that you have.
Absolutely.
So to systematize this part of it, and there's basically these were barriers we were talking about. I also talked a little bit about reform processes within the private sector to convince them also to get into natural capital assessments and so on. Often in private sectors also the problem is that as you get into the small and medium-sized enterprises, you don't have a lot of risk capital or space to move. And within the internal pressure, it's often hard to get into a reform process and to make new processes without having, for instance, public money during a public-private partnership to get into new processes and to new reforms.
Super,
I will say
you.
what this was a very rich discussion.
I can imagine, yeah. And I'm just hearing those warning signs around. We're talking about mainstreaming, but then there's also the pitfalls of mainstreaming. When something is institutionalized, you've got these whole other barriers as well. So yeah, but forewarned is forearmed, right? So in our discussion, I mean, I'll hand over to Antonia now, but we were also talking about just knowing that this is probably going to come up is already really helpful, because you can prepare yourselves, you're ready. So Antonia, would you like to just share from group 3 what came up? Thank you, Andreas, really great.
Okay.
Yeah, just a quick, I think we talk about the challenge, the huge challenge of applying common sense in our discussions. So there is we need to talk with each other, and we need to actually not try to teach things to each other. No, we just need to talk. And it was mainly the discussion. I was like a kind of a dictator and follow what I said, because I start saying that I'm really tired of these kind of discussions because we are getting nowhere. So, and I want to help farmers and producers, and we need advice from ONGs, from politicians, from companies, and we cannot put into practice everything that we are speaking. And that's a major issue. And it's because of the metrics, it's because of the vocabulary. Yes, there are a lot of issues, but sometimes I say, okay, I'm really tired of this. I just want to put in practice things. And that's a huge challenge. And I think to sum up, and Nadine, please correct me if I said anything that is not true or if it's missing something, but I think this is the main idea that we discussed.
Yeah, no, fantastic. And I think what we hope to create in those little breakout room discussions is that kind of that safe space where we could be honest with each other, because actually if we are honest, you get Antonia going, I'm just tired, like I'm just having the conflicting views, and then what did you say, the radical nonsense, right? And so it's tiring dealing with this. And if we're honest about that, then we can also try to find ways, and John is presenting this language now that we can understand and why a system is stuck, and then this idea that we can navigate around it, what can we do about it? So no, really, really great, Antonia. Thank you for sharing so honestly as well. And actually, Philip had some thoughts on what the health community has actually learned over the years as well, of how to, what lessons they've learned to help navigate, and showing how an issue is related to other aspects as well, which came up. So yeah, as we kind of go into the last phase for the wrapping up now, I mean, it is important to kind of ground this in real examples of how we apply this. And so I just want to give a little bit of space in the next kind of 5-10 minutes where we just hear some stories a bit more in detail around what this looked like in practice across a company especially, but maybe another organization. And it speaks a little bit to the question that Christina came up as well earlier, like how much is this related? How much can we apply this to natural capital? Is it very different to others? So Gerard, I know you have a company example that you would like to share with the group, so we can understand a bit more in detail, a deep dive of what this looks like. And also then we'll invite others to, if you're interested, to share a very, very specific case where this is applied. Maybe you talked about it in the group discussion just now, or it's made you think of another example that we can learn from. So yeah, Gerard, if you want to kick us off then in this last part of the session today.
Yeah, and I actually shared this in my smaller group already. So apologies to Christina, Oriane, and the third person, and Giovanni for that. But basically, it was when the Holcim Group, which was a cement company, when they started embarking on the biodiversity strategy journey, there was still the same questions on why is it important, why now, why should we focus on this? But what was very interesting at that time is that 5 submissions for setting up a new factory were kind of stopped because of a biodiversity issue highlighted by local stakeholders. And every single day that the planning or the permitting process was being delayed was basically tons of cement not being sold. So the biodiversity topic was not, was an excuse, but the expression of the business imperative was that every day that was passing by without progressing the permitting process was basically lost revenue, and that was pure monetary. And so this was all away from values and from other items, but it was in the business speech, it was a very good business case. And the CEO basically gave instructions: we need to avoid to be in these situations again. So how can we equip ourselves so that we are fully prepared when we are presenting new plans for building a new factory, and that we have explained or have worked with the local stakeholders and explained to them on how we're taking care of some of these aspects, and then being able to build that plant. Now, reflection of this case study is that this was great at the time of growth. But if we are in a time of recession, and here we are, of course, looking at a post-COVID situation where we have to rethink a lot of our business and our business models, and there is probably a lot of shrinking of business happening as well, then this growth scenario, of course, is not that valid anymore. So that's the other challenge that we have now to rethink of what does this mean when we are in a shrinking or reducing strategy. Now, interestingly, back to the cement sector as well, is the moment that there was actually a financial crisis back in the 2008, 2010, then the decision was to close the biggest polluting plants, because that way there was a co-benefit of actually doing this. So, and there was a kind of synergy between the most polluting plants and probably their profitability, or at least their long-term viability. So again, it was using a business speech, a business monetary language to actually help articulating and integrating some other more social and environmental aspects.
And I remember when we had the chat about Holcim a while ago, we were comparing them with the journey of Lafarge before Lafarge Holcim merged as well. And so Lafarge's journey was actually the much slower, right? Because they didn't have that pressing business need. They were just kind of, my words, like it was like trundling along, but didn't have the urgency that Holcim had at that time. Do you just want to reflect on that part as well, or?
Yeah, and that's where it's also interesting in all these change processes that we're looking at, is how do you make sure that the bottom-up approach, which was the WWF Lafarge way, and the top-down, it's actually the combination of both that will make it work. And that's the fine balance that we need to find as well. How can we create the regulatory pressure that's top-down, and making sure that environmental rules becomes more stringent and make it more difficult for companies to operate and continue to pollute or waste the resources of our planet. But at the same time, how do we work this bottom up by giving them the tools and the means then to also take on these strategies and these actions at a more local level, where the interest is actually working more at the stakeholder basis and introducing the stakeholders in these bottom-up approaches, so that these top-down regulatory pressures are actually responded bottom-up, and then you've got a magic, something that happens. Yeah. And that's a fine line that we have to play all the time. And as IUCN, that's what we try to do. And with the We Value Nature campaign, that's the same that we're trying to do. How can we give the bottom-up energy and tools and ways of driving some of the changes that we want, but at the same time give the advice, the support and ideas top-down, where luckily the regulatory pressure is coming. The governments, the country heads, are wanting to also see changes happening. And the financial world is also looking at some of these changes. So that's another top-down input that we can have.
Absolutely. And actually, Christina, you're putting some interesting comments in the chat box. So I think you should open up and maybe give that a concrete example on the tourism side. But to reflect on that a bit, I think the bottom up and top down is important, and the middle part as well. So as you saw, the We by Nature campaign, we are looking at individual, project and organizational, because yeah, when people say, oh, systems change, we need the levers, we need the policies in place, the regulation, but they still need to trickle down, and it's still individuals at the end of the day who have to understand that, they have to be willing to follow them and then know how to follow them as well. So we need interventions at all those levels, and they need to be aligned in the same direction. So that's just a nicer way of you framing that as well. Gerald, yeah, this top down and bottom up. So I just wanted to support that. So Christina, yeah, you're sharing some interesting thoughts there. So can you maybe, are you talking about community-based tourism as an example, or as a way of framing this? How would you apply this in what we've learned today in this specific context there? What would you do different?
Yeah, we were talking actually about how tourism has been affected by COVID, and whether this was a good opportunity for the emergence of more sustainable businesses, basically, or nature solutions. And I think that one way to convey that message, I was thinking, that is to bring up more examples of resilient business. So which are the businesses that have been quite resilient throughout the crisis? And in the tourism sector, it seems that the community-based, nature-based conservation projects have been far more resilient to the COVID crisis than traditional tourism operations. So I think that, again, try to think about how to cope with the barriers of business, or how to make to give incentives to companies so that they can adopt a more sustainable businesses after the crisis. So that was what I was thinking, and I wanted to share in the chat, not necessarily talk about them.
That's okay. No. Thank you. And I appreciate that. And actually, maybe just for the last part of this final session before we wrap up, John, do you want to just come back in and reflect a little bit on the fail culture, the failure culture that Andreas was picking up on?
Yeah. And actually, can I pause just one before that and just comment on the bottoms up, tops down approach and the resilient business as well, because I think that's very important. One thing in my research I found is something called the middle manager tundra that people refer to, where the top of the organization loved the idea, the bottom of the organization loved it, but the people whose rewards were based on not implementing the idea were the middle managers, and they stopped it happening. So I think it goes to Gerard's comments and everyone else's comments that it's the whole structure which needs to start thinking about the direction and be part of that solution. I think that's important. The other comment before I get to the failure comment, and I'll end on failure, is the flexibility and resilience around COVID. Yeah, I've seen, like, even in Lausanne, a couple of businesses launch because of COVID, using that opportunity to remove one of their barriers to entry into a marketplace. Food delivery from bulk purchase stores where you have reusable bottles which are barcoded backwards and forwards. As an example, it would have been hard to get a business off the ground pre-COVID in that situation, but with people using much more delivery, it gets it off the ground. So on to failure and Antonio's comments. Actually reading through the Google notes from each of the teams, failure was huge in all the discussions. And I think the important thing to remember is, and this goes back to my very first slide of social plus innovation is hard. In traditional innovation businesses, there only maybe 10% or less of the innovations by professional innovation teams make it through to the end. And when you encompass startup companies, it's probably 1% make it through to the end. So innovation itself innately has failure involved with it. It's really, really hard. And then the social innovation part is even harder. And often what we see is the success stories, like the cement success story is a real good example of, we see those success stories and everyone assumes that every innovation can be a success story. There's part of the innovator's journey is to realize along the way, like this won't make it, and I need to either pivot the idea or sort of stop the idea and wait till a better idea comes along. And so I think it's an important realization, and I should have mentioned it earlier, and I liked that the breakout groups discussed that it's an inherent part of innovating, that failure lives around everyone in it.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, and I've said my second favorite acronym actually is FAIL. Actually, FAIL is first attempt in learning. So yeah, we have to have the processes to embrace that failure and learn from it. So we're quickly moving into the final phase, and I think like all the We by Nature 10-day challenge has all been about getting to action as well. So just a chance for you to maybe just write in the chat box, you know, what are you going to do next on this? You know, are you going to now reach out to somebody to help you open the door and have a conversation? Are you going to, I don't know, research more on, you know, agency or something? But yeah, what are you going to do now based on the discussion today? So if you share that in the chat box, and if you've got like in the key aha learning point as well, you know, like when you go back to somebody and say, actually, do you know what I just learned today? I really now know da da da. So yeah, if you can type that in the chat box as well. John and I are going to stay on the call for a little bit afterwards as well. If you've got like any kind of final clarification questions, just want to talk through some stuff with us. But with that, I'd just like to hand back over to Gerard now for the final words and what will be happening next.
Great. Well, thank you, and thank you, John and Nadine, for all your energy in doing this. I also really want to acknowledge the team behind the scenes. You know, Leanne, Ella, and many others that have really contributed to this as well. You don't see them on the screen, always there in front, but clearly without them, we won't have these successful sessions. As you know, this is part of the We Value Nature challenge. We still, you know, into the beginning of the second week, and so we encourage you to continue. We also ask you to provide some feedback to this session. Now, this session for us was quite important from a We Value Nature campaign standpoint, because we are tasked and asked to identify the barriers and see how to best overcome them. And so what we are going to do is really use the last 10 days as a stock take moment to see actually all the things that are happening you know, across the various streams, and see how we can then respond to that, not duplicating efforts that already exist, but really build on what's happening out there. I mean, the words I've learned, you know, through these sessions, or I remembered, is the Winovator. I didn't know that one, and I'll remember that one, and I'll be very careful when somebody's coming with a new idea to actually not to shut it down, but actually look at, hey, how can we use it, adapt it, or not adapt it, and say, take the time and the space to continue to innovate. The other element for me that I heard and noticed is that historically, when we talked about sustainability, we needed to be in a secure space, in a you know, comfortable profit-making situation. Now we clearly realize now in the current new norm that we can't wait for that. The urgency is too high. And we have to allow even a right to failure in some cases. One element that I'm still worried about and conscious about is that we are still in this thinker's world. We have the time and the luxury to be on these workshops. And there is a whole doer's world, and especially in the SME world, for example, that don't have the time to think and to you know, think about these things. Well, they do, but they do it on the job. So the question is, how can we equip them? How can we train them? How can we provide them the tools and the means to continue to be excellent doers, but at the same time integrate, you know, the natural capital journey or the social capital journey into what we're doing. And I'm just hopeful that we'll continue to work with John on the very navigation tools, which is very interesting that in last week's sessions, there were a few sessions around navigation tools, but they really focused on tools and methodologies for applying natural capital concepts. But I'm hearing now of a lot of other navigation tools that are helping the individuals how to sell through their projects and their innovation. So thank you very much for attending. I think the last slide, which doesn't show up, is where you can then provide some feedback. And I also urge you to continue to interact on the Capitals Coalition community space, because we don't want these 10-day challenge to end, you know, in a 2-hour presentation. We would like very much the conversation, sorry, to continue. Nadine and John, I'll leave you with the people that are still with us if you want to have some further chats. I need to shoot off, but it was a pleasure having you. Thank you again, and stay on for the last sessions of the We Value Nature campaign, and especially the ending plenary, where we'll get some reflections of the young generation, which is also very interesting to hear from them sometimes without any filters, what they want and what they are expecting from business to do in this space. Thank you all.
Thank
Have
you.
a great
Thank
afternoon.
you so
Thank you.
much. Thanks for making the time. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Lovely comments.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, the 10-day challenge was inspired after we met John as well. You said that people needed competition events and calls for action. So actually, that's why we came up with the 10-day challenge, because we're like, we don't have any. There's COVID, and there's no more of these call for actions. We need to invent one. So that's where it came from. So.
And that's actually, yeah, I should have referred to that, because that's a good example of an excuse for people to go out there and do, like, I have this idea, I want to go do it. So many people get their early start through challenges or competitions, and there's actually good stuff in organizations which do it as well, like a call to action, like we need to work on aging in place in our organization. How can we help the local communities? I've been involved in those in businesses, and they come out with some powerful ideas from people, because people have energy around them.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the legitimacy piece as well. Like, it's an opportunity for somebody to be able to present, to be seen publicly, to talk about it, which helps their legitimacy as well. So yes, got to create those opportunities. Yeah, no, I feel, this forewarned is forearmed. Like, if we know this is what we're going to need, then you can start planning for it, rather than going like, oh, that would have been a good idea, but it's too late. So.
And that was the purpose of the research. It wasn't, sort of the idea is like, people have been through these journeys. Are there common patterns they come across on the journeys? And oh yeah, they do. And they've reacted to them in these different ways. And so, it's not the right answer for anyone, but it's like, you don't have to go and invent the wheel in each of those situations, because there's other information. Yeah.
Exactly. Yes. All right. I still see some people on here now, so I don't know if they're stuck. Are you wanting to unmute and say or ask a question? If not, we might just start gently letting people go. I guess we stopped recording, Ella, I think, didn't we? So, oh no, we're still